Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is Sheridan Voysey. Sheridan is a writer, speaker, and broadcaster on faith and spirituality. He's the author of 7 books, including The Making of Us, Who We Can Become When Life Doesn't Go as Planned, Resurrection Year, Turning Broken Dreams into New Beginnings, plus Resilient, and the award-winning Unseen Footprints. His writing has been featured in various publications, and he writes regularly for Our Daily Bread. Sheridan is a presenter of Pause for Thought on BBC Radio 2's Zoe Ball Breakfast Show, heard by 9 million people daily, and has conducted over 2,000 radio interviews in his 25-year broadcast career. So he's got a whole lot more experience doing this than I do. So he's been featured on BBC Breakfast, BBC News, Day of Discovery, 100 Huntley Street, and ABC, and in publications like The Times, The Sunday Telegraph, and Christianity Today. So we're really glad to have you with us here today, Sheridan. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's good to be with you, Brian. Thanks for the time. And I'm really impressed, actually, you were able to pronounce all of those words, all of those names, including my own name correctly. Very few people do that. So well done.
Well, thank you. I wasn't exactly sure, but
you struck out correctly.
Well, the other day I was trying to pronounce some book titles in Spanish, and I don't think I did very good on that. But
forget it.
So anyway, maybe you can just start by telling us some of your thoughts and reflections on this pandemic, and in particular, since you're in the UK, what things are like there.
It's a profound moment, isn't it? I mean, they've been used in unprecedented levels, really, to talk about just the shifting moment that we have right now. And I think it will be a shifting moment. I think it is a time of transition. There will be a sense in which we will revert back to some of the ways that we had before, but there's got to be some ways in which life has changed. When was the last time, Brian, that the whole world was living the same story? I mean, even in World War II, I don't know if the same experience was worldwide like it really is now. So my friends in Michigan and New York are having just as many problems homeschooling their children as my friends in Sydney or here in Oxford. We've all got empty streets, whether it be in your country, in my home country, Australia, in Paris. We've got the same experience happening everywhere. And so we are, for the one time, experiencing the same thing. And I'm going to be very interested to know where this leaves us. No doubt people are starting to look at redrawn lines geopolitically. Certainly big questions about whether we need to do as much travel as we do now. We're seeing in some areas that the environmental impact is so much better because we're not traveling as much. I can't remember which country it was. I've just read today that one country is already going to start with Denmark or Sweden, starting to reassess then transport policies based on that and based on the increased quality of the air as a result of not so many cars on the road. Spiritually, it's certainly a fascinating time. You might have heard of the research that came out of the University of Copenhagen recently that said that online searches, Google searches for prayer have gone up exponentially in the last 3 or 4 weeks.
No, I didn't realize that.
It's quite fascinating, and that's happening even in secular countries. So is there a sense in which we're starting to realize all the things that we typically build our lives on, build our identities on? We can't go to the shopping centers where we typically go for meaning and purpose these days, typically go to build a sense of self by buying a brand to make us feel better. All of those things are closed. So there's a sense in which some of those things are being stripped away and we're kind of being left to our own devices and realizing maybe I need more than this. So it will be fascinating to see where this goes. Certainly the financial impacts are going to be profound. I know that your country, as well as here in the United Kingdom, some of the analysts are talking about, we're talking maybe a couple of generations until we can recover financially, ultimately. So look, big changes ahead, and therefore I think our sources of security have been challenged a bit. So I hope that it's the breaking up of the ground for there to be some sort of spiritual change for our countries, for our Western countries.
Yes. I think it's going to be a lot of ground for sociology studies
Oh,
that take a look at the effect during and after all of this.
And don't you find it interesting, Brian, particularly somebody like yourself who's been in publishing for a while, and the fact that we're running to stories to find some sort of meaning out of this. I don't know how it is in the US, but here in the United Kingdom, sales of Albert Camus' The Plague have again had this huge uptake.
Yeah, same thing.
No, I can think of the last story that I'd be wanting to read right now. It's nihilistic. But what are we doing as a culture? We're running to stories to try and work out, well, how is this going to end? What's my part in it? And so, a huge role here, I think, for authors and for storytellers to, and particularly Christian authors and storytellers who've got something eternal to be able to ground people in, to have a moment now to say, well, we have a big story. We've got a narrative that can help to put this into perspective and help us to find a path out of it.
Well, one of my daughters immediately started watching Outbreak and Contagion, these movies that are like, stories about what now is happening. So I don't know what necessarily drives people to want to do that, but it's certainly happening.
Finding some guidance and hope. In the Second World War, John Steinbeck was approached by the American government to not to go and encourage troops on the front line, not to do anything along those lines, not to go and fight, but to write a story. And the story turned out to be The Moon is Down. And it became a huge hit in the underground press in various occupied countries in Europe. And it became a hit because, number one, it represented the situation really quite starkly, what the Nazis were doing, even though it never mentions the Nazis at all. It's all a story about an occupied town and how the locals gathered together to fight this kind of evil enemy coming in. But two, it gave them guidance on how to respond, and it gave this kind of subtle message. The Allies are coming, and here's what you're going to do when the Allies actually come in. Here's how you're going to band together. So, we turn to stories for both hope that things will change, but also guidance on what to do now.
Very interesting analog. So I'm curious as to what churches are like there in terms of, like the shift to online services and things. Is that going well?
Huge. So there has not been the same degree of pushback that I know that in some quarters of the United States, there's been a bit of a pushback about churches closing and other public gatherings, closing and etc. There's been none of that over here. So very early, quite a few weeks ago now, certainly my church and a number of churches, most churches I think in the United Kingdom, moved to an online service. Back in the first week, it was allowed that you could still have a group of people in the same room as long as they were 2 meters apart from each other. Then we had further restrictions that said, well, you couldn't even be in the same room if you're not of the same household. So then, that moved to something like this, where we had, Zoom services with worship leader on one screen and preacher on another screen and meeting leader on another screen, and in some cases band members all on different screens, all in their own homes. That's very common over here now. And I don't know the total statistics, but certainly for a number of churches, it's actually seen their audience, if you like, multiply. Certainly the church I'm a part of, Oxford Community Church, has seen way more views than they would normally have as a weekly attendance. So it's a fascinating time. Is that people just jumping around from stream to stream and finding the best sermon they can? I don't know. But it's interesting times, yeah.
Yeah, well, that actually sounds pretty similar to what's going on here. I mean, I think, probably what you hear in the news is a little bit overblown in terms of the percentage of churches here that are doing those kinds of protests or what have you. Right. But and where I live in New Jersey, it's a pretty hot spot. So most everything is just completely shut down.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, you're right next door to the epicenter, aren't you? So
right. But I've been experiencing and seeing the same kinds of things that you were talking about in terms of online worship services and some of the actually increases in attendance.
Yeah.
So during these conversations, we've been talking also about ways in which in your past God has helped you through challenging times. So would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, there's the subject of at least two books that I've read. I mean, maybe if I'll give you the story as to how we came to the United Kingdom. So, as you can probably tell from my accent, it's not completely plummy British. I was born and raised in Australia to English parents. So I may not have a really plummy English accent, but neither do I have a broad Australian accent because it was always softened from having English parents. But then in 2011, we made the move from Sydney and we came here to Oxford. And therein lies the story that's told by the book that you mentioned before, Resurrection Year. We had tried for 10 years to have a family. We weren't successful. We tried everything during that 10 years that we felt comfortable doing. We had special diets and we had special supplements. We tried IVF. We waited for 2 years on the New South Wales adoption list. We tried healing prayer. We tried chiropractic, Brian, and even that didn't work. I don't know why we tried chiropractic, but anyway, we tried it. Nothing we tried worked. And would you believe that on our very last round of IVF, when we had already decided that if this last embryo that we transferred, if this last embryo that we had didn't work, we were going to move on as a childless couple. It was on that very embryo that we received the phone call from the IVF clinic saying that we were pregnant. And
Wow.
you can imagine we had jubilation amongst our family and friends who've been traveling with us for a decade. And then on Christmas Eve of 2010, the IVF clinic called again and they said, "We're sorry, you're not."
Oh my goodness. Oh, gee.
So with that, my wife, Marin, walked into our room, curled up in a fetal position on the bed. And that's where our 10-year dream ended. Now, after that, it really was kind of time for Marin in particular to have a consolation prize. The big dream wasn't going to come true. So was there a consolation prize? And the only other thing that she really wanted to do with her life was to live and work overseas. And she got offered a job at Oxford University a few months later. We saw that as God's provision. And so from that, we then came over to Oxford. So she has been, she's been working on the vaccine trial for COVID-19.
Wow.
Which as we speak today has just begun. It's been months in the making, but literally years of work pressed into a couple of months of work. And the trial has begun today. So that's big news. But the move from Sydney to Oxford was more difficult for me because in Australia, I had a national radio show, I had book contracts, I had speaking engagements. And when I came here, I had no platform. I didn't have a profile. Publishers turned me down. BBC back then weren't returning my phone calls. Nobody was asking me to speak at their conferences. And so it precipitated something of an identity crisis for me. And so long story short, out of that came Resurrection Year, subject in the subtitle, Turning Broken Dreams into New Beginnings. And that book has taken me then around the world in the end. It got rejected by British publishers. It got picked up by you lovely Americans, Thomas Nelson.
Congratulations.
Thank God for you Americans. We bless your heart. And that's opened doors for me all around the world and has, by the grace of God, been the kind of catalyst for people, not just who have gone through infertility, but people who have never been able to get married or who've married and gone through a divorce, or people who have never been able to get their career or have lost their career to start again. And then that was followed up with this latest book, The Making of Us, Who We Can Become When Life Doesn't Go As Planned. Here's the beautiful cover that I absolutely adore. That has been a follow-up and particularly focusing on identity and purpose when life has gone wrong, when life hasn't gone as planned. Could it be that that is the moment that God uses to make you who you're meant to be, to shape your character, to potentially put you into a different place of service, as my experience has been, at the very least, to build into you a whole bunch of things that you can pass on to other people that you otherwise would never have had to be able to give to other people as a result of going through your trial. That's a long way of answering your question about how God has been with us during the difficult times. There were times, Brian, that just hearing God say no to us about that whole journey of trying to start a family would have been a mercy. It would have stopped short a lot of pain, would have made it a lot easier to live, would have caused the end of a lot of arguments. And yet we never heard God say, no, this is not my will for you. We never heard any word from God when it came to our desire for having children. Neither keep going and try IVF or stop, this isn't my will. Only now, all these years later, are we, I think, starting to see some of the purpose, if you like, the reason, at the very least, the redemption or the recycling of our experience into something purposeful. So it's a mixture of both mystery and also blinding surprise at the cleverness of God at taking these difficult moments and turning them into profound new opportunities for identity and purpose and service to others.
Wow, what a story. That's just amazing. Before we started the recording, you and I were talking about how we're both Frederic Beakman fans.
Yeah.
And one of his essays that you may recall is called The Stewardship of Pain.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And, I think Mr. Beakman would really be proud of the stewardship of your pain and what you turned that into. That's just an amazing story. And congratulations to you to listening, to paying attention, as he would say too, and making lemonade out of lemons.
Well, he's been an inspiration for me literarily. And Brian, if you can get me in the room for him, look, I'll take 2.5 minutes. That's all I need. But he's a classy writer, and he is somebody who has indeed mined his pain with his father's suicide and everything else into meaningful words for other people. So I remember when it was suggested to me by a friend, a writer over here named Adrian Plass, that really we should be writing our story into a book. I remember I returned to Beakman's slim memoirs to just see what you do, how you do that. So he was certainly a great inspiration, a leading light in this whole area.
He's kind of been a mentor to a whole lot of people that he'd never actually met.
Indeed.
I've heard that from so many writers.
A great legacy of a great writer, that he has been able to be present in the homes and minds and hearts of so many people that he's never met.
Yes. So what kind of resources, books, ideas do you have for helping people through the rest of this journey that we're going to be on for a while yet here, I think?
Yeah, it is a time of look, I think this is a moment where the ground of our own personal lives can be dug up a little bit, and new seeds can be planted for new things. So I have had all of my speaking engagements pretty much for the rest of the year. There's a couple in August and September that might keep on going, but they're all, they've been cancelled, and that's my income as well. And yet this has been a moment to try new things. So at the moment, I'm running an online retreat, which has been oversubscribed. I wasn't expecting the kind of response to it. And again, on the topic of who you can become when life doesn't go as planned, based on the making of us. And so that has been a wonderful new experience to do. So I think this is an opportunity for us all to grow. Now, for some of us, we have to keep on working from our homes and things like that. For others, a friend of mine he's done as much work as he possibly can, and it's almost like an enforced sabbatical. This is a time to grow in terms of reading and books and online courses and things. Profound. There's so many possibilities out there. I would definitely suggest Beakman's books, as we've already talked about. Some of the other books that I would say, the books that actually do help us reflect and go deeper. Some of Barbara Brown Taylor's books are very good and very reflective at going deep into the darkness of the world. In terms of fiction, I've recently tried hard to balance my reading diet in terms of just supplementing it with some fiction. And I've been getting into George MacDonald's works. Now, anybody who knows C.S. Lewis knows that his great mentor, and he finally admitted it at one stage, his great mentor, both in theology and also in his fiction with the Narnia Chronicles, was George MacDonald. Largely forgotten writer today. You can find all of his works for free online, but some of the most profound fiction. So I would give two suggestions there as to some books to read. A well-known one is called The Princess and the Goblin. I'm reading that at the moment. It's very, very good. But the best one that I've read so far from him is called The Wise Woman. Read The Wise Woman. It's not so much a fantasy novel as a parable of God coming to people who desperately need change and need to change, and the way that in the guise of the wise woman, he works that change. So I would suggest just some of those things to supplement some of your reading with good fiction. I've also been reading Flannery O'Connor just to get a little bit of Southern American or the Southern States writing in there. Again, she was a wonderful writer, particularly good at locality and particularly good at characterization and being true to the character of a place and the character of a person within a space. So that would be some of the suggestions off the top of my mind. I have to admit the rest of my reading, Brian, has been very much based on some of the projects that I've got coming up. And so I'm just continuing to work and kind of focus on some of those projects ahead, which kind of, some of them are coming a little bit forward in terms of the diary now, because I was expecting them to be longer term projects and now turning out to be closer term projects.
Well, now that you're not traveling all over speaking, it gives you time to undertake some of those things that had to wait otherwise.
Indeed. And I wonder too, and this maybe relates to something that I'm working on at the moment, I wonder too whether we're going to be forced to rethink the very notion of friendship in this COVID time as well. This moment has revealed how close our friendships are. Friendship is one of the most neglected topics in our modern era. It has been pushed out by eros. If we want to use the Greek words, philia is the Greek word for friendship. Eros is the great Greek word well known for romance and eroticism, sexuality. And then agape is the great Christian word for sacrificial love. Well, in a strange kind of way, in the last few decades, really, we've had in the general culture for our Western kind of world, we've had eros push out philia. So all we think about now, you listen to the songs on the radio, the songs in our playlist, the majority will be love songs. How many songs can you think of that really celebrate friendship? All of our movies are about love, are about romance. We've got the rom-com. All of our books are predominantly about other things than friendship. In fact, if you go back millennia, Aristotle and Cicero were writing deep treatises on friendship. And what do we think about when we think of a book about friendship today? We think about some sort of sentimental book with nice pictures of smiling people and a few sentimental sweet quotes in it. It's in a gift book, the gift book aisle. We need to have a renewed focus on friendship because we have single person households rising exponentially. We have birth rates decreasing. We have family breakdown continuing. And we have this important thing called friendship, which is being neglected. In this moment, we're discovering how close our friendships are. If we are sick and we need somebody to actually drop food around to us, who do we call? At the same time, this could be the kind of liminal moment, as the sociologists call it, where we can form new friendships because we need them so much and we're in a shared crisis together. So that would be another area I'd suggest that maybe we could look at in this moment, is to just have a renewed focus on friendship and see indeed just how deep our friendships go, or how transactional they might be. Are they simply there just for professional purposes? How many deep friendships do we have? Deep friendships. We could call it 2 o'clock in the morning when everything's gone wrong.
I think that really is some fertile ground, for exploration and kind of study in today's environment. And I mean, for what it's worth, I've had some pretty significant, at least for me, thoughts about that over the last couple of years too, where, you know, the world of the past was predominantly the case where friendships were limited by geography, right? Who you happen to live near, you know, relatively speaking. First was the distance of a horse and buggy. Now maybe it's the distance of a car or mass transit or something like that. Whereas I know personally, because I've been doing so many conferences across, you know, a pretty wide geography, I've been having so much interaction with other authors, either in webinars like this or phone calls or online or what have you. My feeling has been that I'm closer to many of the people that I deal with in other parts of the country than I am to people that are in my immediate geography.
Right.
And because it's just such a greater commonality of values and interests. And this whole pandemic and what we're going through now is just accelerating that.
Yes.
So for what it's worth, you know, I've been rethinking the whole concept of friendship myself, you know, in those kinds of terms.
Yeah. And you won't be alone in that as well. In fact, some of the closest friends I have are long-term friends that are all in other countries. And so they are accessible via Skype. And what has taken us closer has been shared experiences, shared stories, a much greater willingness to share the deeper aspects of our lives, which of course you don't do with anybody on the street or with an acquaintance. At the same time, the physical distance means at 2 o'clock in the morning, if there is a crisis, I can't call them to come over and help.
Right.
And so we always need to be, you know, building those deeper connections in our locality as well. And as somebody who's been in this country now for 9 years, you know, it's required intentionality, and you start anew. And so that's what I'm thinking that my next writing project and probably broadcasting project will be all about, is trying to stimulate that as to, well, what are the components? What is the true component of friendship versus companionship? And how can we be intentional about taking some of those people in the category of acquaintance, you know, maybe start moving them towards companion, start moving them towards friends, and start moving our friends towards close friends. What are those factors that we can learn and do? So we can share notes down the path a little bit, Brian.
Good. Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. Well, let's switch to your books a little bit. We haven't talked enough about them yet. I know you mentioned, you know, some of the stories behind them, but can you share a little bit more? It sounded like the last two that you wrote would really be useful for people right now.
Well, it's funny. You know, the subtitle for The Making of Us is Who We Can Become When Life Doesn't Go as Planned. And hello, life is not going as planned.
Exactly.
The majority of us. So there's no doubt there has been a rising interest in The Making of Us again. Came out a year ago, but of course it's still selling. It's still a new book, and it's a memoir, and memoirs have a longer shelf life. So absolutely, this moment has us kind of changing our plans. I've got friends who have lost their jobs. No doubt you do as well. I've got a lot of friends in America who've lost their jobs, or who have their children coming back to live with them because they've been furloughed or something like that. Don't know what's going to happen with their jobs. Certainly, we don't know what kind of work environment we're going to be returning to. So what does that mean then in cultures that do predominantly build identity on profession? Really, our Western cultures build that identity on one of two bases. One is profession, and so when we talk to somebody, we ask, what do you do in terms of do for pay, and parental status. How many children do you have? Do you have a family? And so it really comes down to it. So what is a typical guy when he's asked? Well, yeah, I'm an engineer by trade, and I'm a father of 4. Or for a woman, sometimes it's reversed. Actually, I'm a mother of 3, and I'm a graphic designer. And so those are the two bases that we so often build our sense of identity on. Well, what happens when the marriage hasn't worked and there's no children? What happens when the marriage hasn't even happened? What happens when in a time like this, you're not too sure what's going to happen with your career and your profession? What happens then? So that was my experience. I couldn't become a father. And then when I came over here to the United Kingdom, writer, speaker, broadcaster, I'd spent at that time 15 years developing that identity. Didn't look like that was going to go on. So there was 2 or 3 rocky years there. I wasn't too sure who I was. And so really, I mean, this is a time for Christians to really go deep into an identity that most of us will assent to up here, but few of us will probably live out of down here. At least I wasn't, which is the identity of being a child of God. That's an identity that can never be taken away from us. It is irrespective of success or failure or marriage or achievement or career progression, irrespective of all of those things. Now, Brian, I had preached on that topic. I had written articles for magazines about that topic. But then when I lost those other identities, I really had to discover, well, how deep has that truth really gone for me? And so that's been a wonderful journey for me, is actually to go deep into that, to rest in that. But that's my primary identity. All the other ones are secondary. They're good, important. Being a parent is a good identity. It's an important one. Being a broadcaster, a writer, author, whatever it might be, engineer, teacher, all of those are good, important identities. But they're not primary. They're all very vulnerable to this fragile world. And so that's the invitation. And so, I really hope that people might have an opportunity to read The Making of Us and Resurrection Year. Both of them really kind of go deep into that. The Making of Us more so into that particular subject, and go deeper into that child of God identity. And then the second part of that is then to see that the thing that you've been through can result in your greatest gifts being offered to the world. It can turn out to be the profound game changer for everything that you are and everything that you share with the world at large. I look back at those 15 years before us coming here and then going through all the changes that happened. I was hosting a radio show, and I was almost like an apologist really on the air, and we saw some great things happen. But if I was to compare it to the ministry that's opened up since going through that time, it's hard to see that they are comparable in terms of the amount of lives changed and lives touched, particularly through the 2 books, and then through speaking and conferences and things like that. There is something that happens when you are vulnerable with your story, when you get to that stage, and I don't think anybody should jump to that stage quick, but when you get to a stage where you can share that story vulnerably, it gives others permission to then be vulnerable with you, and that's where the space is opened up for healing. And then the next process after that is for that to be recycled into all the things you've learned through that to be then shared with other people. So it's a profound, almost, when I go and speak at conferences of childless couples or, people who've gone through really difficult times, I'm almost excited because what's in store for you people? What's in store? You've been through such trials, such loss. But if you walk with God through it, you could see profound things happen as a result of him recycling this into something good. So,
well, good for you for, taking that message forward to people who need it.
Yeah, wasn't my choice. I often get called on by the BBC here when they want to talk about childless men. That was not my brand. I was on my USP that I was, planning into my 15-year professional plan. But there is something that very few men talk about, and in going public about that, it's resulted in a lot of men being able to come forward and finally admit that there is a shame involved in not being able to be a father, even if they're not the biological problem. And that's when we can then journey to healing and journey into that new life that that God promises and they can find.
Well, just to finish up, I think you have a reading that you were going to give us. Would that be okay now?
Yeah, so The Making of Us is a story of a pilgrimage that a friend and I take from a little island in the north of England called Lindisfarne, otherwise known as Holy Island, considered a birthplace of Christianity in the United Kingdom. Really, it's 6th, 7th century is really where the Christian gospel spread from there to the rest of the mainland. And so a friend and I, we did a kind of an 8-day pilgrimage down to a place called Durham. And it was all about, discussing between the two of us, about identity and purpose and recycling, all the things that I've just been mentioning. And so I end the book on a creed, which kind of draws together all the things that I've learnt through not just the pilgrimage, but then writing the book. It was 2 years of work writing the book. And that's become something of a kind of a popular, shareable online. We've turned it into a video. If you want to see some beautiful North English scenery, then head to sheridanvoysey.com, head to themakingofus.com, then you'll be able to see it there. It's probably the easiest URL to give you. And there's an abridged version of it there. So might be a nice way for us to finish, kind of draws some of the themes together that we've been talking about.
That'd be great.
Starts like this. The hand that spins the galaxies brought me into being. The one who holds the stars has made me his own. I am God's child. My life is rich. My days are sacred. I am held by a love that's wider and higher than the farthest edges of this expanding universe. I am a pilgrim in this world, in search of wisdom and wonder. I will take new adventures and follow God into the unknown. What I achieve is not as important as the person I become. So I will seek to imitate the nail-pierced one. I will step in the direction of my strengths and talents. They are spirit-given tools for my God-given tasks. I will pay attention to my persistent aspirations. They could be the whispers of God. I will serve all I can and walk deeply with a few. I will aim for great things, but leave my legacy to God. The path is long and the terrain at times hard. Still, I will not wish for another's life. I will take my place, play my part. Something important will be missed if I don't, for the hand that spins the galaxies wants me here.
How beautiful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Sheridan. And thanks for joining us today to have this conversation. It's really been wonderful to get to know you. And I know that your words and your books have already been helpful to many people and will continue to be so. So thanks for sharing so much with us.
Yeah, great. Good to talk to you, Brian. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.